Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. For this episode, I'm joined by Ambassador Arun Singh, former Indian ambassador to the United States and currently a non resident senior fellow at Carnegie India, to discuss the broader context of US India relations in light of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's upcoming visit to the United States. Ambassador Arun Singh, welcome to Interpreting India. In the next couple of days, between the 21st and 23rd of September, Prime Minister Modi will be in the United States. He'll attend the Quad leaders meeting in Wilmington, in Delaware, President Biden's hometown, and then take a set of meetings at the UN and with US CEOs in New York. But as he does that, I thought it might be worth taking a step back and thinking about the last 4 years. So if we think about this as the Modi Biden era, my first question to you is, how do you see this particular period? Is it a new book in India-US relationship, or is a yet another chapter in a pretty long book that started as early as, say, 1945?
So I think it's another chapter in a long book, but I wouldn't say started in 1945. I would say started in 2000, because that's when the positive phase in the relationship began with the visit to India by President Bill Clinton in 2000. Because before that, we had almost an adversarial relationship. There were a lot of differences during the time of the Cold War, during the unipolar phase. But building on the past efforts of both Democratic and Republican presidents since 2000, President Biden and Prime Minister Modi during these 4 years have significantly advanced the relationship. Now, there have been challenges. There were differences related to Afghanistan, related to some of US actions in Pakistan, for example, the F-16 sustainment package, and differences, let's say, on the Russia-Ukraine issue. But that aside, if we look at the positive, among the very significant decisions that have been taken, first and foremost, the decision to initiate the initiative on critical and emerging technologies in January 2023. Here was a signal that at a time when US was restricting technology access to China on national security grounds, the national security advisors of India and the US met and signaled that on national security grounds, they believe US and India should partner in high levels of technology, including AI, quantum, cyber, 6G, biotech, semiconductors, defense, and space. And after that, there have been a lot of developments in this initiative in terms of semiconductors, in terms of defense cooperation, and many other areas. And I think the second significant step has been that using the background of ISET, they have further advanced the defense cooperation arrangements. US has now authorized the transfer of technology to India, 80% transfer technology for the GE F414 engine. And the US says that this is higher than what they have authorized to any of the other partners, including their NATO allies. So that's one signal. They've authorized a sale of Reaper drones to India, two of which India had leased when it had the conflict in Garhwal in 2020 with China. And through a new mechanism, the India-US Defense Acceleration Ecosystem, INDESEX, they are bringing together startups in both India and the US to look at co-development of technology. So that's another important dimension. And I think what they've both done is, aside from strengthening the bilateral relationship through technology partnerships, they are also looking at doing more and more together in plurilateral arrangements. And that's something new for India and the US, because that's where we had our major differences in the past. So, for example, India has now joined the Artemis Accord, where there are about 30 countries looking at joint effort in space. India has joined the Mineral Security Partnership, where there are 15 members, again looking at a secure supply chain for critical minerals, a sector which is otherwise heavily dominated by China, where there are concerns. US and India have launched the IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe corridor from India through the Gulf to Europe, again, a new framework for plurilateral cooperation. And earlier they had launched the I2U2, India, Israel, UAE, and the US. So they are signaling that we are going beyond the bilateral, also doing multilateral. And then President Biden, building on what President Trump had done in 2021, elevated the Quad meetings to summit level meetings. And President Biden is now going to host the sixth summit of the Quad leaders on 21st September. And four of these six would have been hosted by the US, showing the level of importance the US attaches to this framework. So I think in terms of positives, technology, defense, plurilateral arrangements, these are some of the new and enhanced elements of cooperation that have been brought in by Prime Minister Modi and President Biden.
So, Ambassador Singh, if I take a step back and I'll come back to ISET and the defense relationship and where that may be going, what do you think is driving this kind of fervor in India-US relations? I mean, you spoke of ISET, that's a kind of a pretty novel structure. You've been watching this very carefully. You've contributed largely to this process in many different ways. But what's driving kind of the cementing of ties between US India? So some would say it's structure. So some would say it's the changing nature and character of geopolitics. Many say it's agency. It's individuals, for instance, in both countries who see an opportunity to kind of to cement these ties. How do you understand drivers?
So I think one can say it's all of the above. So there are certainly a lot of factors that bring benefits to both countries. The first is bilateral. If you just look at trade, India-US trade is now $200 billion. US is India's largest trading partner. India has a surplus in its trade with the US at a time when India is an overall trade deficit country. For US also, India is among the 10 largest trading partners. And the India-US bilateral trade has increased some 15 times in the last 20 years. You can see the direction in which it is headed. US is the largest foreign investor in India with investments totaling more than $50 billion. And what is interesting is that Indian companies have by now invested more than $40 billion in the United States and have a presence across all 50 states. If you look at Indian students, we have now 300,000 Indian students in US universities, the largest number. There are more than 4.5 million Indian origin persons in the US, well integrated with US society, administration, politics, economy. You see all the CEOs of major companies who are of Indian origin. And now there's an Indian American person, Indian origin person who is in the running to be president. So it shows the integration with US society. So that's at one level. The second is that both have an element of convergence in terms of the challenge they are facing from China. India has its own challenge. You see the situation along the line of actual control. But as far as the US is concerned, they have said repeatedly that their main economic, technological, and military challenge today is China. It is the only country in the world with both the intent and capability to replace the US in the international system. So they have an immediate challenge in Europe from Russia, they have a challenge in the Gulf, but China is what they see as the long-term challenge. And US has absorbed, and the US companies, that if they want to win this competition against China, then they need a partnership with a country like India, which has a population of 1.4 billion, which is the same size as China's population. So if you look at the number of Indian tech entrepreneurs, human capital that is working in Silicon Valley, if you look at the number of global capability centers that US and Western companies are setting up in India, now there are already 1,600 such centers, which are supporting the global operations of US companies, not just in terms of the Indian market. And from back offices, they have now matured to be doing cutting-edge R&D and technology development work in semiconductors, in jet engines, and various different dimensions. So they believe that the technology partnership with India will be important for the US as it maintains its global lead in the technology competition. So that's another driving force behind the US India partnership. And of course, in terms of the convergence in the challenge from China, they feel that by working together, not only will they strengthen themselves, each other, but they would also be able to ensure their own interests in the Indian Ocean and Pacific region. And that's how you see the Quad playing a greater role. So I think it is these factors that is driving the relationship, but human agency is important. If I look at the US India relationship from 2000, at each stage, the US president and Indian prime minister have played an important role in driving the relationship. In 2000, it was President Clinton who took the decision to support India against Pakistan in the Kargil conflict. And then he made a visit to India in 2000, a 5 day visit, followed by a 5 hour visit to Pakistan. And then it was President Bush who pushed the civil nuclear cooperation agreement through the US bureaucracy, where there was often opposition and also in the Congress, to see it through to strengthen the partnership with India. And it was President Obama who took himself the decision, for example, to invite the Indian Prime Minister in 2009 as the first state visitor of the Obama administration. And then he came to India as chief guest on Republic Day. No US president before that or since has done that. And again, there was a lot of division in the US government, but President Obama took the call to come out and declare support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. So at each stage, the presidents and prime ministers on both sides, and you remember Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had to face a no confidence motion in the Indian Parliament to see the civil nuclear agreement with the United States through. So they have faced challenges, but they have brought their own influence to bear to take the relationship forward. So the human agency has certainly been very important.
Given all that you've just said about all the good things that's happened in the India-US relationship, and it's been an evolving story since the early part of this century, if I just take you back to, say, August of 2021, with the sudden withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan that left our far yard with a group of actors, the Taliban, which at that time was nothing but more than a loose coalition of insurgent groups trying to figure out what leadership would even mean. There was a lot of disparaging views in India at the time about America's commitment to global security. There were many, even officials in India, who came out and said, "Is that look, how could you do this to India? Our own mission, for instance, in Kabul had a tough time getting out. And there was a lot of last minute coordination, lives were at risk, and so on and so forth." Um, if you rewind to that particular point in time, are you surprised by the many advances that have taken place in these various sectors, industry, semiconductors, defense, ISET, and the general momentum that has generated in the last 2 to 3 years?
So, Rudra, I'm not surprised. And the reason is that, look, every country takes decisions based on its own perception of its national interest and based on the political compulsions of their leaders. They don't decide necessarily to help another country or help some other leader. They are taking it in their interest. Now, where there is convergence, countries work together. And that's why I think as they consolidate their relations, both India and the US have to understand that there will be differences on many issues, and they have to give space to each other for those differences. Our history is different, our geographic location is different. And you mentioned Afghanistan, which is one example. The other example I can mention is, for example, Pakistan. Despite everything, despite their difficulties with Pakistan, in fact, no US president has visited Pakistan since 2006, given where the relationship is. Despite that, the Biden administration authorized a $450 million sustainment package for the F-16s with Pakistan. Of course, they made the argument that we are not enhancing their efficiency, we are just maintaining the aircraft. But from Indian point of view, it's a very thin line that if you're sustaining them, they're able to operate better. But then they were looking at their own interest. They were looking at maintaining these aircraft they had supplied. They wanted access to the Pakistani leadership. But not just the Biden administration. I'll take you back to the Obama administration in 2016, at a time when we had good relations with the Obama administration. In fact, 2016 was the year when they declared India a major defense partner. But then for their own reasons, they went ahead and the administration authorized sale of 18 F-16 aircraft to Pakistan. because they felt they needed to reach out to Pakistan at that time to get some support in the context of the Taliban. So it happened that we were able at that stage to lobby the US Congress, and the US Congress blocked that transfer at that stage. The US Congress would see itself as a co equal branch of government. Or if you take during President Trump, several positive developments. He places India on strategic trade authorization level 1. He revitalizes the Quad process in terms of their responses to the strategic challenge from China. The Quad starts with official meetings, then the foreign minister level meetings. The Pacific Command, based in Hawaii, is made Indo-Pacific Command. They have this whole strategy on the Indo-Pacific. He starts a 2+2 foreign defense minister level meeting with India. But while all this was happening, at the same time in 2019, he invites Imran Khan to the White House, the Pakistan Prime Minister, at a time when they wanted Pakistan's support in the context of the Taliban. And there he says in a public event that he's ready to mediate on Kashmir, and that the Indian Prime Minister has asked him to mediate on Kashmir, which is simply not possible. And the Indian Foreign Minister had to say next day that there's no truth in what the President has said. So one has to be able to factor in that there will be decisions by both sides in their own national interest. There will not be convergence. They have to give space for that as they build on the convergences. And so that's why in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, US has a certain position, but India has a very strong relationship with Russia, a defense partnership, a new energy partnership. And we have to see how we handle that, keeping in mind our own interest. So India has not quite gone along with the US. India has not criticized Russia, has not condemned Russia, had not voted against Russia at the UN. But at the same time, the Indian Prime Minister has said that this is not an era of war. He has visited Russia, followed it up with a visit to Ukraine. So India has to approach it from their own perspective. So I think if we allow for the fact that there will be decisions by both sides at times that the other side doesn't agree with. But that doesn't mean that they don't see a broad convergence. That doesn't mean that they don't see advantage in deepening the partnership. And they certainly see that. And that is why both sides are making effort to advance the relationship.
If I can ask you a question on China, if we think of China as a denominator um, that at some level shapes or defines the current state of relationship and all its various derivatives on the economic side, industrial side, defense side. Whenever American committee members from the US Congress or US congresswomen or men come across to India, many of those conversations, on China start with them basically saying, "Hey, listen, we're thrilled about the fact that you guys actually went and banned TikTok, for instance. You've got stringent measures on investment screening going back to April 2020." Ambassador Singh, if down the line, for whatever reason, if India decides to open the playbook with China, return political and economic relations, say in a hypothetical world, if we're convinced of the fact that things on the boundary are better and that it's time to kind of create a strategic channel with China, do you think that'll impact the various derivatives that you have outlined in the first part of this podcast with the United States?
I don't think so, for several reasons. First, Rudra, China is a denominator, but not the entirety of what is driving forward the India-US relationship. The strengths in the bilateral relationship are very important. And again, US also sees that the influence India has across the globe, especially with developing countries. And that's another area where US is in strict competition with China in terms of influence, in terms of economic and technological partnership. And therefore, what India brings to the table is, again, very, very important. But that having been said, US has its own communication arrangement with China. They have said that while they are in strict and severe competition with China, they want to keep communication channels open so that they don't want competition to lead to conflict. Therefore, there should really be no anxiety in case the whatever is happening in terms of communication between India and China is increased. Already, the foreign ministers have met on several occasions. The NSA of India met his counterpart. So at that level, some communication is happening. There's a working mechanism for border consultation that meets regularly, and that has continued through this tense phase. Border meetings have been taking place. So all that is going on. So even if the situation with China eases, and there are no clear indications as of now that that is happening, but even if that eases, I don't think that is really a worry for the policymakers and strategists in the US about where the India-China relationship going. It's been a difficult relationship since the 1950s. And it's more than 70 years of that. So the strategic competition will remain, and I think it will remain the same for the US because whatever be the immediate level of rhetoric between US and China, the longer term competition has come to stay. And I think we all have to factor that in.
So, what are then, according to you, the big challenges for the India-US relationship? I mean, if I look at the last 3 years, for instance, there seems to be a cognitive shift on the part of the current US administration and the Biden administration to say is that, look, at some level, India is the future. That the investments over the next 10 years are in India's favor for a whole variety of reasons: diversification, China plus one, supply chains, like minded partnership, Quad, and so on and so forth. Both sides weathered very difficult situation when it came to the war in Ukraine, which, as you rightly pointed out, had both sides with two different sets of imperatives. Both sides weathered the issue of, say, importing oil, which was more political in Europe than it was in the United States. There has been the issue of rights that keeps coming up now and then, whether it's a report that comes out of some bureau in the State Department or the other. But there seems to be this general sense, at least in both the US and India, that despite the bureaucratic frictions, the strategic direction and the cognitive shift is towards a stronger path. So, for you, what are the real challenges that will put a break in that path?
So, Rudra, I don't think there is necessarily a break, but there will be challenges, there will be obstacles that people will need to learn to manage better. We are doing more and more together, but I think we have to learn even better to manage our differences. Already, some of these changes, for example, Russia, Ukraine, the difference in the past could have been disruptive. But now there's an ability to manage better. India has positioned itself in a certain way. The US Secretary of State has said that, we understand India's compulsions. Relationship with Russia developed at a time when the US was not willing to be that kind of a partner. Now the US is willing to be that kind of a partner. Or the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, that with India we're playing the long game. But in terms of the continuing challenges that I see, is one related to technology partnerships. Because now both are saying that technology has become the defining parameter for the relationship. But it's a new area of cooperation between them. So they have to understand the two systems, they have to be able to do more together. So going ahead, first, the various export control regulations in the US will need to continue to be addressed because they're still a challenge. I know many of the Indian companies who are working in this area point out that approval sometimes takes 6 months, a year or more. Sometimes there may be denial. So that has to be addressed. The two governments have set up a mechanism, the strategic trade dialogue, led by the foreign secretary on the Indian side. So they have to try and continue addressing this issue. You may have seen that recently in the context of AUKUS between US, UK, and Australia, they brought in a new mechanism whereby for that framework of cooperation, the ITAR kind of approvals would not be required on a case-by-case basis. And then the entire set of approvals, pre-approvals would have been granted. Now, I think that's really a far cry in the India-US context as of now, but step by step towards easing of export approval. So that would be important. Second, I think we need to involve the private sector and industry and the academia more and more into this dialogue, going beyond just the government, so that actual cooperation leading to technological research outcomes, leading to business joint ventures, all that are facilitated. So I think that's additional step that needs to be done. On the rights issue, I think that's something that's not new. It has gone on for quite some time, and even before 2014, one saw the same thing. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Some of the reports coming out of the State Department were critical of India. Some of these issues, and the basic response that I saw from India was that all societies face challenges, and no society had really the right to tell another society how to handle their challenges. And the best way to go about it was to get into a very serious discussion about how each society is dealing with its own challenges and what could be best practices that others could look at. But you can't come in a prescriptive manner. And if you look at US society today, it has deep challenges related to racism, related to minority issues. If you see the viral messaging going out in the US social media on immigrants, some of which reached the presidential campaign. So US society faces its own challenges on human rights issues, and but that's really the US institutional challenge. Whatever be the internal challenges, they feel that in the external context they need to take certain positions, which of course others don't agree with. So I think that's the second set of things that we will need to handle. Third is whenever there are differences, because of the history of the past, various conspiracy theories come into play, as if it's deliberate and its effort is being made to undermine one or the other. I think a deeper understanding of how decisions are taken, the compulsions on both sides, and a habit of managing differences will enable us to address some of these challenges better. So I do see that hindrances, irritations will keep coming up, but I don't see anything that is really a break. And again, if you look at the context since 1945 that you referred to, in the first phase, it was a bipolar world order where India and the US ended up on different sides because US said that if you're not part of a military alliance and with us, that means you're against us. And India didn't want to be part of a military alliance. In the unipolar phase after 1990, US basically tried to spread US preferred policy decisions and options on the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and which didn't meet India's interests. But now, in the current multipolar context, with this intense global contestation between US, China, and Russia, I do believe that US will continue to see value in deepening the partnership with India.
Thank you. Ambassador Singh, last question to you. Prime Minister Modi will be meeting President Biden, I think, for close to a dozen times in person, maybe the number's 10 or 11. They've clearly had a special 3 or 4 years. A lot has been achieved, as you say. Challenges remain, but much has been achieved. What's that one-on-one dynamic going to look like between the two principals? You've dealt with such situations as DCM in Washington, D.C., as ambassador. What's that going to be like for kind of essentially the last official meeting with President Biden?
No, I'm sure the dynamic will be very, very positive because President Biden himself, over the last 20 years, has been involved in the India relationship. As ranking member of Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is involved in the passage of the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement through the US Senate. As vice president, he had visited India in 2013. He had spoken about the India-U.S. relationship being among the most consequential during that visit. And as president, he has taken several steps that we spoke about, the ISET, elevating the Quad to summit-level meetings. So he sees value in the India relationship and his meetings with Prime Minister Modi on several occasions. And he invited Prime Minister Modi in 2023 as a state visitor of the Biden administration, which is a level of a visit that the US does very, very rarely. And on that occasion, Prime Minister Modi was also invited to address a joint session of the US Congress for the second time, which an opportunity that very few world leaders have got. So he's invested that. And then if you look at Prime Minister Modi, since becoming PM in 2014, a lot of effort in advancing the India-US relationship with President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, building personal relationships with them. The President Obama's visit as chief guest on Republic Day, President Trump joining the Indian Prime Minister in September 2019 in a Howdy Modi rally in Houston for 50,000 Indian Americans. Very unusual for a US president to join the rally for a visiting leader. And President Biden himself, several meetings with the Indian Prime Minister. He was here for the G20 summit in September last year. So I think when they meet, there will be a lot of personal warmth. And I think a lot of satisfaction that they can both derive for continuing with the sustained and accelerating path for the India-US relationship.
Ambassador Arun Singh, there's much to talk about in the near future. Trump, Kamala Harris, elections in November and its outcomes. But we hope to have you back in October to analyze that. For right now, thank you so much for setting out that deep context, which will in many ways inform and shape the next couple of days in during the Prime Minister's visit to the United States. Thank you for joining Interpreting India.
Thank you, Rudra. Happy with the discussion.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast from. To learn more about our research and the team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening and see you next time.